Last time we covered a couple of potentially useful passages from the book, The Art of War, and this time we're yanking from the bookshelf something I think is both more applicable to our fun pastime, but also a way more interesting read in general. Yes, viewers, today we're covering Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings. Though in reality we're sort of only really covering 3 of the 5 rings, but I digress. As opposed to Sun Tzu, Musashi is definitely a person that actually existed. He also happens to be the star of my all-time favorite manga, Vagabond, which I would recommend if I thought it would ever get finished.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because
Musashi was an insanely accomplished sword fighter who, in the few years preceding his death, wrote down his thoughts on becoming a non-shit sword fighter. Well, competitor from our perspective. As with the Art of War video, I will not be covering the book in its totality. Just a few standout passages that I think can teach us some important lessons, or help us reflect a bit. So, let's take a closer look, shall we? In the Book of Five Rings, Musashi is, well, let's say, not very kind to his contemporaries in the field, noting how several schools of martial artists are adding a lot of superfluous fluff to their teachings. These days, the men making their way through the world calling themselves martial artists are generally only teachers of sword techniques. In this way of the martial arts, especially, form is made into ornament, the flower is forced into bloom, and technique is made into display. Someone has said that the immature martial art is a source of great injury, and this is certainly the truth. He then goes on to define what he himself considers true martial arts. What is most basic in the way of practicing the martial arts is overcoming your opponent in each and any event. To learn how to use one sword in each hand should not be a time-consuming event. To learn how to wield a sword in one hand, first take up 2 swords. This is the way to learn how to hold a sword single-handed. A sword feels heavy and difficult to wield for anyone at first. A bow is difficult to draw, and a halberd difficult to swing. But you get used to any weapon. For the bow you gain strength, and if you practice with the sword you will gain strength in its way and come to handle it well. Admittedly, there maybe aren't an amazing amount of likenesses to be drawn from sword fighting and competing in a game. But I still think one thing here really rings true. Beginner players in particular tend to forget that the process of improving, especially early on, can be broken down into just playing and then reflecting on the results. Getting bogged down in theory fighting tends to be not very useful for beginners, and can actually end up being very detrimental. There are no other actual routes to getting stronger as a player than actually playing. If they existed, then you wouldn't have to go searching for them. On the path of attaining the true way, you leave the principles behind after having attained them. For in the way of the martial arts there is natural freedom. You naturally gain an extraordinary strength. You know the rhythm of the moment, you strike naturally, and you hit naturally. This passage reminded me of a similar one from Daigo's book, The Will to Keep Winning. In an attempt to not stagnate and become a player that favored this or that style, or position on the screen, or match pacing, or character really, Daigo purposely leaves behind strategies that have been working for him in order to challenge himself to find new ways to play and win. Personally, I don't limit myself by trying to win in any one particular fashion. In fact, I actively avoid always winning in the same way. When people mention something they consider a strength of mine, I deny it and avoid using whatever it is they have pointed out. When changing yourself, the trick is not to consider if the change is for the better or for the worse. If you make a change and realize it is for the worse, just change again. The more important thing is to keep changing. Thanks, Daigo. Now, this might not be super useful for beginners, and it also definitely comes with the caveat that if you find yourself in a situation where said strategy you discarded is incredibly useful, you probably should aim to pick it up again. But I think Daigo's long-term record speaks for itself in terms of not allowing yourself to find a crutch. Adopting this strategy can be pretty useful if you find yourself plateauing as a player. Pretty early on in the book, Musashi writes this, which struck a chord with me. With weapons, just as with other things, you should not make distinctions or preferences. Going too far is the same as not going far enough. Without imitating others, you should take what is appropriate to yourself and use a weapon you can handle. Now, the following here might not be as useful for beginners as intermediate players, but I think it's important for every caliber of player to think about this. I think we as players often end up poisoning certain aspects of a strategy or a game for ourselves by watching too much gameplay early on and basing our view on something from that alone. This also goes for guide work produced by other players. That's why I think things like lists of top 10 moves or build orders in StarCraft can end up negatively affecting your game instead of being helpful. A viewpoint I'm definitely not alone in having.
Build orders reference with this supply count up here, or secondarily, they're viewed with this timer down here. And the idea is there must be some way to optimally arrange all my buildings to get a huge, big, badass army. And then I can do all sorts of awesome things with it. That's the build order, the order in which you make your buildings, as dictated by the food or the time. I hate this idea. I hate how prevalently this is thrown into the community.
I make it a rule nowadays that I try to spend a couple of days with a new character or strategy before I look up how others approach it. This can lead to figuring out uses for strategies that are considered poor or impractical by other people. And on the flip side, it really helps highlight why someone is doing something you yourself have not implemented yet. This next passage I personally find pretty interesting. Think of things as if they were done just for you, and do not consider simply looking at it, familiarizing yourself with it, or trying to imitate it. Rather, you should consider these principles as though they were discovered from your own mind. A problem that I think most, if not all players, or humans really, struggle with is being either too critical or not critical enough of other people's input. Trying to approach outside feedback as if it originated from your own mind might help you look at stuff from a more or less critical viewpoint depending on your particular personal outlook. This might not work for all people, of course, but I feel like it might help promote more honest reflection on feedback. I doubt I'm exaggerating when I say that having a more objective review method is going to be extremely helpful for your personal growth. Pretty late in the Book of Five Rings, Musashi talks about the value of the unexpected. In the martial arts of one-on-one, when you think you've come to a situation of even ground, it is essential to change your thinking immediately, assess your opponent, and understand how to gain the victory by another method. Fear resides in all things, and the heart of fear is the unexpected. In the martial arts, you can frighten an opponent with your body, you can frighten him with your sword, and you can frighten him with your voice. It is essential to do this suddenly, when your opponent is not expecting it. Take advantage of this fear and gain the victory immediately. This again reminds me of something that Daigo reflects on in his book, where he writes about how he purposely aims to fight players who he either dislikes personally, or that plays in a style that he himself does not favor. Past experience has shown me that if I don't get along with a person, I probably will not like their playstyle either. For that exact reason though, I say go out of your way to play against those you dislike and overcome your feelings. If you only surround yourself with those you like and agree with, it will of course be comfortable for you, but you will not overcome your preconceptions and become any stronger. It is by actively working with those we dislike and confronting our weaknesses that we are first able to shed our skin and make real strides in growth. The unexpected helps stimulate your growth, and also helps you build resolve to compete under high pressure situations. Now, I understand that the prospect of purposely going out of your way to have a bad time does not seem very enticing. But if you earnestly take on every disrespectful Ken,
oh my god. Yes, just do random uppercuts.
Stance dancing Xiao Yu, hunters going face,
We don't need to trade.
or Protoss player cannon rushing you,
He's gonna win game one, dude.
Perfectly placed
Oh
pylon
yeah,
too.
no, he has this prepped. Is there any way to lose this?
I don't think so.
He's cannon rushing.
you will come out stronger for it.
No, I guess he did not. Oh god.
That's it. GG Maru takes game one.
Oftentimes when people say that they had a good match, it was generally because it was even, and they understood the way the opponent played and their thought process. Even matches can stem from a lot of things, of course, but relegating your play to fighting opponents you feel comfortable against is not a great way to evolve as a player. Yes, this concludes our brief look at the Book of Five Rings. Now, as I said in the Art of War video, there's definitely more in this book if you're interested. Definitely more stuff that's actually usable, but I mean, there's a ton of stuff that is potentially useful for you depending on, your outlook in life. I mean, who can forget this passage? When you've faced off with your opponent and your swords are equally set, it is essential that you be constantly intent on stabbing his face. If you keep your mind on stabbing your opponent's face, you will have various advantages for victory. You should make thorough effort in this. For this reason, you should not forget about stabbing at your opponent's face. Among the disciplines of the martial arts, this is a principle you should practice. As you can probably tell, I own a copy of the Book of Five Rings. This is the William Scott Wilson translation, which I guess I would recommend. But if you don't want to spend money, because I'm pretty sure that this is not one of the translations that is freely available, you can just, Google it. There's PDFs of the translation that you can read for sure. In closing, I think I would give the Book of Five Rings 7 out of 10 Seth Killians, which I think is a pretty fair rating. I think it's an interesting read. It's pretty short as well, just like The Art of War. A little bit longer, but, still pretty short. And probably more useful as a whole. If you did enjoy this video, please do consider subscribing or liking the video or anything like that. It takes a long time to do these things, so why not, give me some love back. And with that, I guess I'll see you guys around some other time.